My name is Marcus, and what I'm about to tell you happened 6 months ago in my apartment building in downtown Portland. I'm still trying to process it all, and honestly, I'm not sure I ever will. I'd been living in the Meridian Heights complex for about 2 years. It's one of those older buildings from the 1960s. Decent rent, thin walls, and the kind of neighbors who keep to themselves. My apartment was on the 4th floor, 4A, right at the end of the hallway. The only other unit on my floor was 4B, directly across from me. For the longest time, 4B had been empty. I'd occasionally see maintenance guys going in and out, but no actual tenant. I liked it that way. Having the entire floor to myself meant I could play music, have friends over, or just exist without worrying about disturbing anyone. That changed when Elena moved in. I first saw her on a Tuesday morning in March. I was heading out for work when I heard the elevator ding, followed by the sound of someone struggling with heavy boxes. When I opened my door, there she was, a woman in her early 30s with shoulder-length black hair, wearing a simple gray sweater and jeans. She was trying to maneuver a large cardboard box through her doorway. "Need help with that?" I offered, stepping into the hallway. She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected anyone to be around. For just a moment, I caught something strange in her expression. Not gratitude or embarrassment, but something closer to annoyance. "No, thank you," she said quickly, finally getting the box through the one door. "I can manage." "I'm Marcus, by the way. I live right across the hall in 4A. "Elena," she replied, but she didn't smile. Instead, she seemed to be studying my face intently, like she was memorizing it. I should get back to unpacking. She disappeared into her apartment before I could say anything else, closing the door with a definitive click. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing Elena's patterns. She worked from home. I could tell because her car never left the parking garage during the day, and I'd occasionally hear the faint sound of typing through the thin walls. She ordered groceries for delivery rather than shopping herself. Most notably, she seemed to have an uncanny ability to know exactly when I was coming or going. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. I'd open my door to leave for work, and within seconds, I'd hear her door open too. She'd step into the hallway, pretend to check her mail, and watch me walk to the elevator. When I came home in the evenings, the same thing would happen in reverse. Her door would open just as I reached my apartment. It was weird, but not necessarily alarming. Some people are just naturally curious about their neighbors. Then, I started noticing her at my window. My apartment faced the building's courtyard, and from my living room, I had a clear view of the opposite wing. Elena's apartment was positioned so that if she stood at her kitchen window, she could see directly into my living room. I first caught her there on a Thursday evening while I was watching TV. Just a silhouette behind the glass, perfectly still, facing my direction. When I looked again a few minutes later, she was gone. This became a regular occurrence. I'd be cooking dinner, reading a book, or just relaxing on my couch, and I'd get that uncomfortable feeling of being watched. Every time I looked up, there she was, a dark figure framed in her kitchen window, staring across the courtyard at me. I started closing my blinds more often. The situation escalated about a month after Elena moved in. I was coming home from a late dinner with friends. It was probably close to midnight, when I noticed something odd. As I walked down the 4th floor hallway toward my apartment, I could see a thin strip of light under Elena's door. But as I got closer, the light suddenly went out. I stopped walking and listened. Complete silence. I continued to my door and fumbled with my keys, trying to be as quiet as possible. That's when I heard it. The soft sound of Elena's door opening just a crack. I could feel her watching me, even though I couldn't see her in the darkness. "Elena," I called out softly. "Is everything okay?" The door immediately clicked shut. I stood there for a moment, key halfway in my lock, trying to process what had just happened. Why would she be watching me come home? And why did she hide when I acknowledged her presence? The next morning, I decided to address it directly. I knocked on Elena's door around 9 a.m. figuring she'd be awake since I could hear her moving around inside. She answered after a long pause, opening the door just wide enough to show half her face. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes. "Hi, Elena. I wanted to check on you after last night. You seemed, I don't know, maybe upset about something?" Her visible eye narrowed slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about. When I came home around midnight, I thought I saw you at your door. I just wanted to make sure everything was all right." "You must have been mistaken," she said flatly. "I was asleep. But I knew what I had experienced. The light going out, the door opening, the feeling of being watched. It had all been real." "Okay," I said, forcing a smile. "Well, if you ever need anything, I'm right across the hall." She closed the door without responding. Things got progressively stranger after that conversation. I started finding small items moved around in the hallway. The decorative plant that sat on the windowsill would be shifted a few inches, or the welcome mat outside my door would be slightly askew. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make me question whether I was remembering things correctly. Then, I began receiving packages that weren't mine. The first one arrived on a Wednesday. I found it outside my doors when I came home from work. A small brown box addressed to E. Vasquez, 4B, but left at my apartment instead. I knocked on Elena's door to give it to her. "This was delivered to my door by mistake," I said when she answered. She took the package without looking at it, but I noticed her hands were shaking slightly. "Thank you," she said, starting to close the door. "Elena, are you sure you're okay? You seem really on edge lately." She paused, and for a moment I thought she might actually open up to me. Instead, she said, "You ask a lot of questions, Marcus." The way she said my name sent a chill down my spine. There was something cold and deliberate about it, like she'd been practicing. More packages followed over the next 2 weeks, all addressed to Elena, but consistently delivered to my door. Each time I returned them, she seemed more agitated. During our last exchange, she barely opened her door at all, just extended her hand through the crack to take the package. "Maybe you should talk to the building manager about the delivery mix-ups," I suggested. "Maybe you should mind your own business," she snapped, slamming the door. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about Elena's behavior was deeply unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the package deliveries weren't accidents. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps that stopped right outside my door. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps didn't continue toward the elevator or the stairwell. They just stopped. I crept to my door and looked through the peephole. Elena was standing directly in front of my apartment, facing my door. She wasn't moving, wasn't doing anything. Just standing there in the dim hallway light, staring at my door like she could see through it. I watched her for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. Finally, she turned and walked back to her apartment. The next morning, I called the building manager. "Hi, this is Marcus Chen in 4A. I'm having some concerns about my neighbor in 4B, Elena Vasquez." "I'm sorry," the manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, said. "Did you say 4B? "Yes, Elena Vasquez. She moved in about 6 weeks ago." There was a long pause. "Mr. Chen, apartment 4B has been vacant for 3 months. We haven't had any new tenants on the 4th floor." My blood went cold. "That's impossible. I've been talking to her. She's been living there for over a month. I can assure you, sir, that apartment is empty. In fact, we've been showing it to potential renters. I was just there yesterday afternoon." I hung up the phone and immediately went to Elena's door. I knocked loudly, then pounded when she didn't answer. "Elena, I know you're in there." Silence. I tried the door handle, expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily. The door swung open, to reveal a completely empty apartment. No furniture, no boxes, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. The walls were bare, the carpet showed vacuum marks from a recent cleaning, and there was a faint smell of fresh paint. But I had been talking to Elena just the day before. I had seen her, heard her moving around, returned packages to her. How could the apartment be empty? I called Mrs. Rodriguez back, my hands shaking as I dialed. "I'm in 4B right now," I said, when she answered. "It's empty, but I swear someone has been living here." "Mr. Chen, I think you should come down to my office. There's something we need to discuss." 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from Mrs. Rodriguez in her cluttered office on the first floor. She had a thick file folder open in front of her. "Mr. Chen, I've been the manager here for 8 years, and I've never had a situation quite like this. About 2 months ago, we started getting complaints from other tenants about someone on the 4th floor. Strange noises, people seeing a woman in the hallways who didn't belong to any of the apartments." She pulled out a security camera photo, grainy and black and white, but clearly showing Elena walking through the building's lobby. "We've been trying to figure out how she's been getting into the building, and specifically into 4B. The locks haven't been tampered with, and she doesn't appear on any of our entry logs. It's like she just appears." "Who is she?" I asked. Mrs. Rodriguez pulled out another document, a police report. "Elena Vasquez was a former tenant here. She lived in 4B about 3 years ago. She was evicted after multiple complaints from neighbors about erratic behavior, harassment, and what appeared to be some kind of mental health crisis." She paused, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Chen, Elena Vasquez died 2 years ago. Apparent suicide. She was found in her car about 10 miles from here." The room started spinning. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to process what she was telling me. "That's impossible. I've been talking to her. She's been watching me, following me around the building." "I believe you," Mrs. Rodriguez said quietly, "and you're not the first person to report interactions with her. We've had 3 other tenants describe similar experiences over the past year. Each time, it starts the same way. She appears to move into 4B, begins obsessively watching and following a specific tenant, then eventually disappears." "What happened to the other tenants?" "They all moved out within a few months, said they couldn't handle the constant feeling of being watched." I left Mrs. Rodriguez's office in a daze. When I got back to the 4th floor, I stood in the hallway between my apartment and 4B, trying to make sense of everything. The empty apartment door was still slightly ajar from when I'd opened it earlier. That's when I heard it. The faint sound of typing coming from inside 4B. I pushed the door open wider and stepped into the empty apartment. The typing stopped immediately. The silence was deafening, but I could feel a presence in the room with me, watching me from somewhere I couldn't see. "Elena," I called out. "I know you're here." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I could see my breath forming small clouds in the air. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard her voice. The same flat, emotionless tone I'd grown to recognize. "You asked too many questions, Marcus." I spun around, but the apartment was still empty. I ran out of 4B, slammed the door behind me, and didn't stop running until I reached my car in the parking garage. I moved out of Meridian Heights the following week. I couldn't bring myself to spend another night on the 4th floor, knowing that Elena was still there, still watching, still waiting for the next tenant to fixate on. Sometimes I wonder if she's found someone new to follow, or if she's still standing at that kitchen window, staring across the courtyard at an empty apartment, waiting for me to come home. My name is Jessica, and I need to tell someone about what happened in my apartment last month. I've been going over it in my head every single day since I moved out, and I still can't make sense of it all. I had been living in the Riverside Gardens complex for about 8 months when the Hendersons moved into the unit next to mine. It was a ground floor apartment building from the 1980s. the kind where you could hear your neighbors' conversations through the walls if they spoke too loudly. My apartment, 12C, shared a wall with 12D, and for most of the time I'd lived there, 12D had been blissfully quiet. The Hendersons seemed like the perfect neighbors when they first arrived. David Henderson was probably in his late 40s, tall and thin, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His wife Margaret appeared to be around the same age, with short blonde hair and a warm smile. They had a teenage daughter named Amy, who looked to be about 16 or 17. I introduced myself the day they moved in, bringing over a plate of cookies as a welcome gesture. Margaret answered the door and was incredibly friendly, inviting me in for coffee and chatting about the neighborhood. David was polite but quieter, mostly focused on directing the movers. Amy stayed in her room the entire time, which I figured was typical teenage behavior during a stressful move. "We're so excited to be here," Margaret told me as we sat at their kitchen table, surrounded by unpacked boxes. David got transferred for work, so this is all new for us. Amy's having a hard time with the move, but I'm sure she'll adjust. "It's a nice quiet building," I assured her. "Great neighbors, and the landlord is pretty responsive if anything needs fixing." For the first few weeks, the Hendersons were model neighbors. I'd occasionally hear normal household sounds, footsteps, muffled conversations, the TV in the evening. David would wave when he saw me in the parking lot, and Margaret always stopped to chat if we ran into each other at the mailboxes. But I never saw Amy again after that first day. It started to strike me as odd. After about a month, I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, so I was around the apartment most days. I'd hear David leave for work every morning around 7:30, and Margaret would usually go out for errands or what sounded like a job sometime mid-morning. But I never heard Amy leave for school, never saw her coming or going, never even heard her voice through the walls. When I mentioned it to Margaret during one of our mailbox conversations, she got a strange look on her face. "Oh, Amy's been homeschooled for the past few years," she said quickly. "She's very shy, prefers to stay in her room most of the time. You know how teenagers can be." I nodded, but something about Margaret's explanation felt off. Her voice had changed when she talked about Amy, become more strained, like she was reciting lines she'd practiced. That night, I paid closer attention to the sounds coming from next door. I could hear David and Margaret moving around, having quiet conversations, watching television. But there was something else. A rhythmic tapping sound that seemed to come from what I assumed was Amy's room. It wasn't loud, just a steady tap, tap, tap that would go on for hours at a time. I figured she was probably doing homework or maybe had some kind of nervous habit. I'd been a fidgety teenager myself. The tapping continued every night for the next 2 weeks. It was always the same rhythm, always from the same location in their apartment. During the day, when David and Margaret were out, the apartment was completely silent. No movement, no sounds at all. It was like Amy only existed in the evenings when her parents were home. Then one night, the tapping stopped abruptly around midnight, and I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was crying. Not the normal crying you might expect from an upset teenager, but a desperate, muffled sobbing that sounded like someone trying to cry as quietly as possible. It went on for about 20 minutes before fading into silence. The next morning, I debated whether to say anything to Margaret. The crying had sounded so distressed, so hopeless, but I also didn't want to overstep boundaries or make assumptions about their family dynamics. I decided to test the waters by asking Margaret how Amy was adjusting to the move. "She's doing much better," Margaret said, but her smile looked forced. "Just needs time to settle in, you know." "I thought I heard her upset last night. Is everything okay?" Margaret's expression immediately changed. The friendly warmth disappeared, replaced by something colder and more guarded. "Amy's fine," she said curtly. "She's just going through a difficult phase. I'd appreciate it if you didn't worry about sounds from our apartment. Old buildings carry noise in strange ways." She walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing by the mailboxes feeling like I'd crossed some invisible line. That evening I heard David and Margaret having what sounded like an argument. I couldn't make out specific words, but their voices were tense and urgent. The conversation seemed to be about Amy. I caught her name several times, but I couldn't understand the context. The tapping didn't happen that night. Instead, there was complete silence from Amy's room. Over the next few days, I became increasingly concerned. The apartment next door was quieter than it had ever been. I still heard David and Margaret moving around, but the rhythmic tapping that had become such a constant presence was gone. More troubling, I hadn't heard any sounds at all from Amy's room. No footsteps, no movement, nothing. I started paying closer attention to the Hendersons' routine. David left for work every morning like clockwork. Margaret would leave around 10 and usually return by early afternoon with grocery bags or shopping bags, but I never ever saw Amy. On a Thursday afternoon, I was working at my kitchen table when I heard Margaret come home. She was talking to someone, but I could only hear her side of the conversation. "I know you're upset, but this is how it has to be," she was saying. "We've talked about this. You know why we had to move." There was a pause, like she was listening to a response, but I couldn't hear another voice. "Don't give me that look," Margaret continued. "We're doing this for your own good. You'll understand when you're older." Another pause. "No, you cannot go outside. We've been over this 100 times. The conversation continued for several more minutes, always with Margaret speaking and then pausing as if listening to responses I couldn't hear. Finally, I heard her say, "Go to your room. We'll discuss this later when your father gets home." I heard footsteps moving through their apartment, then the sound of a door closing firmly. That night, the tapping resumed, but it was different. More frantic, more urgent. Instead of the steady rhythm I'd grown accustomed to, it was erratic and desperate sounding. It went on until nearly 3 in the morning before finally stopping. I was starting to seriously worry about Amy. The one-sided conversations, the isolation, the desperate tapping. It all painted a picture of a teenager who might be in some kind of trouble, but I wasn't sure what to do about it. I didn't have any concrete evidence of abuse or neglect, just a growing sense that something was very wrong next door. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning. I was having coffee on my small patio when I heard shouting from the Hendersons' apartment. It was David's voice, louder and angrier than I'd ever heard it. "I don't want to hear another word about it," he was yelling. "You'll stay in that room until you learn to behave." There was a sound like furniture being moved, then a door slamming so hard it shook the wall between our apartments. Margaret's voice followed, pleading and desperate. "David, please. She's just a child. This isn't right." "She's not a child anymore," David snapped back. "She's 17 years old, and she needs to learn that actions have consequences. But keeping her locked up like this? It's been months. She needs fresh air. She needs to see other people. She needs to learn to control herself. Until she can do that, she stays where she is." I heard Margaret start to cry, and then the apartment went silent. I sat on my patio for a long time, processing what I just heard. It sounded like Amy was being kept locked in her room, possibly for months. The tapping, the crying, the fact that I'd never seen her, it all suddenly made horrible sense. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure what. Calling the police felt extreme, based on overheard conversations, but I couldn't ignore what seemed like a clear case of abuse. That evening, I decided to try a direct approach. I knocked on the Hendersons' door around 7 o'clock, when I knew they'd both be home. David answered, looking surprised to see me. "Hi, David. I was wondering if I could speak with Amy. I'm a graphic designer, and I thought she might be interested in learning about digital art. I could give her some pointers if she's interested." David's expression immediately hardened. "Amy is not available." "Maybe another time then? I'm home most days if she ever wants to come over." "That won't be necessary," David said firmly. "Amy doesn't need any outside influences right now." "Outside influences?" I just thought she might enjoy learning something new. It must be hard being homeschooled, not having much interaction with other people. David stepped closer to me, and I could see anger flashing in his eyes. I think you need to mind your own business. Amy is our daughter, and how we raise her is not your concern. He started to close the door, but I put my hand up to stop him. David, I'm worried about her. I haven't seen her in months, and some of the things I've overheard. You've been listening to our private conversations? His voice was dangerously quiet. The walls are thin. I can't help but hear when they're shouting. David stared at me for a long moment, then said, If I hear that you've been eavesdropping on my family again, or if you continue to harass us about our daughter, I'll be calling the police. Do I make myself clear? He slammed the door before I could respond. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the sounds from next door. There was no tapping, no crying, no sounds at all from Amy's room. But I could hear David and Margaret having another heated conversation. She's asking too many questions, David was saying. We might need to move again. We can't keep running, Margaret replied. This has to stop, David. What we're doing to her isn't right. What we're doing is necessary. You know what she's capable of. You know what happened before. She was just a child then. People change. People grow up. Some people don't change. Some people are dangerous no matter how old they get. The conversation continued, but their voices dropped too low for me to hear clearly. I caught fragments. Something about the last time and what she did to that boy. And we can't take any chances. I didn't sleep much that night. By morning, I had decided to call the police. Whatever was happening to Amy, it wasn't right, and I couldn't stand by and do nothing. But when I looked out my window that morning, the Hendersons' car was gone. I knocked on their door. No answer. I peered through their windows and saw that the apartment was completely empty. No furniture, no belongings, nothing. They had vanished overnight. I called the landlord, who confirmed that the Hendersons had broken their lease and moved out without notice. They'd left no forwarding address. Did they say anything about their daughter? I asked. Amy. The landlord sounded confused. Daughter? The lease application only listed David and Margaret Henderson. No children. But they had a teenage daughter. Amy. She was about 16 or 17. Ma'am, I met with the Hendersons personally when they signed the lease. There was no daughter. It was just the two of them. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment trying to make sense of everything. The tapping, the crying, the conversations about Amy. Had I imagined it all? But I knew what I'd heard. I'd heard Margaret talking to someone, heard David shouting about keeping her locked up. I called the police anyway and reported what I'd witnessed. The officer who took my statement was polite but skeptical. So you never actually saw this alleged daughter? He asked. No, but I heard her. The tapping, the crying, and I heard her parents talking about keeping her locked in her room. Ma'am, is it possible you misunderstood what you were hearing? Maybe they were talking about a pet, or maybe you were hearing sounds from a different apartment. I knew how it sounded, but I also knew what I'd experienced. The officer took down my information and said they'd look into it, but I could tell he didn't believe me. A week later, I was cleaning out my storage closet when I found something that made my hands shake. It was a newspaper clipping that had somehow gotten mixed in with my belongings. Probably fell out of a box during my own move months earlier. The headline read, "Local teen dies in apparent suicide after psychiatric hold." The article was about a 17-year-old girl named Amy Henderson, who had died by suicide 3 years earlier while being held at a psychiatric facility. She had been committed after attacking a classmate with a pair of scissors, nearly killing him. The article mentioned that she had a history of violent outbursts and had been homeschooled for several years due to her inability to function in a traditional school environment. Her parents, David and Margaret Henderson, had moved away shortly after her death. I stared at the clipping for a long time, trying to process what it meant. Had the Hendersons been so traumatized by their daughter's death that they were somehow recreating her presence in their new home? Had I been hearing the echoes of their grief, their guilt, their desperate attempts to keep their dead daughter close? Or had Amy somehow followed them to their new apartment, trapped in the same room where her parents had kept her locked away in life? I moved out of Riverside Gardens 2 weeks later. I couldn't stand the silence from 12D, couldn't stop listening for the tapping that would never come again. But sometimes, late at night in my new apartment, I still hear it. That desperate, rhythmic tapping of someone trying to communicate from a place where no one can hear them. And I wonder if Amy Henderson is still out there somewhere, still locked away, still tapping on walls that no one will ever answer. My name is Rachel, and I need to tell someone about what I discovered in my neighbor's backyard last summer. Even now, months later, I wake up in cold sweats thinking about it. I moved into the house on Maple Street in early June, right after my divorce was finalized. It was a small 2-bedroom ranch in a quiet neighborhood, exactly what I needed to start over. The house came with a decent-sized backyard that I was excited about, since I'd always wanted to try gardening but never had the space in my old apartment. My next-door neighbor was a man named Robert Kellerman. He appeared to be in his 60s, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He lived alone in a larger colonial house that had clearly been well-maintained for decades. When I introduced myself the day I moved in, he was polite but reserved, offering to help with my boxes, but not lingering for small talk. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, shaking my hand with a firm grip. "I hope you'll be happy here." "Thank you. I'm looking forward to settling in. Your yard is absolutely beautiful, by the way." Robert's face lit up at the compliment. "Gardening is my passion. I've been working on it for over 20 years. If you ever need any advice getting your own garden started, feel free to ask." And his yard truly was spectacular. From my kitchen window, I had a perfect view of Robert's backyard, and it looked like something out of a magazine. Perfectly manicured flower beds, exotic plants I couldn't identify, and a greenhouse near the back fence that gleamed in the sunlight. Everything was arranged with mathematical precision, creating patterns and color combinations that were almost hypnotic to look at. I spent my first few weeks unpacking and getting settled, but I found myself frequently drawn to the kitchen window to admire Robert's garden. He was out there every morning by 6 a.m., tending to his plants with the dedication of a scientist. He wore the same outfit every day: khaki pants, a white button-down shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat to protect him from the sun. What struck me most was how methodical he was. He carried a small notebook and would stop frequently to write in it, sometimes measuring plants with a ruler or taking what looked like soil samples. It seemed like an unusual level of documentation for a hobby garden, but I figured he was just very serious about his craft. In July, I finally started working on my own backyard. I wasn't nearly as ambitious as Robert, just a small vegetable garden and some flower beds along the fence. But I was excited to have a project, something to focus on besides the loneliness of living alone for the first time in 15 years. Robert noticed my efforts immediately. The morning after I'd spent a weekend digging up a patch of lawn for tomatoes, he appeared at my back door with a cup of coffee in his hand. "I see you're getting started on your garden," he said, gesturing toward my modest plot. "Mind if I take a look?" I was grateful for the company and eager for advice from someone who clearly knew what he was doing. Robert walked around my yard, examining the soil and asking questions about what I planned to plant. His knowledge was impressive. He could identify the pH level of my soil just by looking at it and recommended specific fertilizers for the vegetables I wanted to grow. "The key to a successful garden," he told me, crouching down to examine my freshly turned earth, "is understanding that every plant has specific needs: light, water, nutrients, but also space. You have to give each plant exactly what it requires, no more and no less." It seems so complicated, I admitted. Your garden makes it look easy, but I'm already feeling overwhelmed. Robert smiled, but there was something strange about his expression. It's not complicated once you understand the principles. Plants are very predictable, unlike people. They respond exactly as you'd expect if you provide the right conditions. He helped me plan out my garden layout, suggesting which plants would thrive in different areas of my yard. His advice was invaluable, and within a few weeks, my small garden was flourishing beyond my expectations. But as the summer progressed, I started noticing odd things about Robert's routine. He worked in his garden at strange hours, not just the early morning sessions I'd observed, but also late at night. I'd wake up around midnight to use the bathroom and see lights on in his greenhouse, his silhouette moving around inside. When I mentioned it casually during one of our conversations, he explained that some of his plants required attention at specific times. Certain species are very sensitive to temperature fluctuations, he said. I have to monitor them constantly to ensure optimal growing conditions. I also noticed that Robert received a lot of deliveries. Large bags of what I assume was soil or fertilizer arrived weekly, always dropped off by the same unmarked truck. The delivery driver never stayed long, just unloaded the bags near Robert's garage and left without any paperwork or conversation. Most puzzling was the smell that occasionally drifted from Robert's yard. It wasn't the pleasant scent of flowers or the earthy smell of rich soil. It was something else. Sweet and cloying, with an underlying note that reminded me of meat that had been left out too long. The smell was strongest on hot, humid days, and seemed to come from the area near his greenhouse. When I asked Robert about it, he dismissed my concern. I use organic fertilizers, he explained. Fish emulsion, bone meal, that sort of thing. It can be quite pungent, especially in this heat. That made sense, but something about his explanation felt rehearsed, like he'd given it before. In August, I started having trouble with my own garden. Despite following Robert's advice perfectly, my plants began dying. It started with the tomatoes. The leaves turned yellow and wilted, then the entire plants collapsed within days. Then the peppers, the lettuce, even the hardy marigolds I'd planted along the border. I was devastated. I'd put so much time and effort into the garden, and it had been doing so well. Robert was sympathetic when I told him about the problem. Gardening can be heartbreaking, he said, examining my dying plants with a concerned expression. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, things just don't work out. But I don't understand what went wrong. Everything was growing beautifully just 2 weeks ago. Robert knelt down and touched the soil around my tomato plants. The soil feels different, more acidic than before. Sometimes the ground chemistry can change unexpectedly. He offered to test my soil and recommend solutions, which I gratefully accepted. But privately, I was starting to suspect that something more deliberate was happening to my garden. That suspicion grew stronger when I noticed that the dying seemed to follow a pattern. The plants closest to the fence line between our properties died first, then the damage spread inward toward my house. It was almost like something was seeping through the soil from Robert's yard into mine. I decided to do some investigating on my own. Late one night, I crept out to my backyard with a flashlight and examined the fence line more carefully. The soil along the border was darker than the rest of my yard, and when I dug down a few inches, I found a strange, oily substance that had an acrid chemical smell. Someone had been pouring something into my garden, something that was killing my plants. The next morning, I confronted Robert about it. I tried to be diplomatic, suggesting that maybe some runoff from his fertilizers was affecting my soil, but his reaction was immediate and defensive. "That's impossible," he said sharply. "I'm very careful about my applications. I would never do anything to harm a neighbor's garden." "I'm not accusing you of doing it intentionally," I said, "but I found some kind of chemical residue along the fence line, and my plants are dying in a very specific pattern." Robert's expression hardened. "Perhaps you should consider that your gardening techniques are simply inadequate. Not everyone has the skill or dedication required for successful cultivation." His tone was cold and condescending, completely different from the helpful neighbor I'd come to know. I left the conversation feeling unsettled and more convinced than ever that Robert was deliberately sabotaging my garden. But why would he do such a thing? What could he possibly gain from destroying my small vegetable patch? The answer came to me a few nights later when I couldn't sleep and found myself staring out the kitchen window at Robert's yard. He was in his greenhouse again, working by lamplight. But this time, I could see more clearly what he was doing. He was digging. Not the careful, methodical plant tending I'd observed before, but serious excavation work. He had a full-size shovel and was creating what looked like a deep hole in the floor of the greenhouse. As I watched, he disappeared from view, apparently climbing down into whatever he was digging. I grabbed a pair of binoculars from my bedroom and returned to the window. Through the greenhouse glass, I could see Robert moving around in what was clearly an underground space. He was carrying something, bags or bundles that he placed carefully in different areas of the subterranean room. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was looking at. Robert hadn't been growing just plants in his greenhouse. He'd been using it to hide an underground chamber, and now he was moving things around down there in the middle of the night. The next day, I called the police. I felt foolish explaining my suspicions that my neighbor might be hiding something in an underground room beneath his greenhouse. But the officer who took my call was surprisingly receptive. "We've actually had some inquiries about that address before," Officer Martinez told me. "Nothing concrete, but a few people have reported strange smells and unusual activity. We'll send someone out to take a look." 2 days later, I watched from my kitchen window as police cars pulled up to Robert's house. I saw officers talking to Robert on his front porch, then walking around to examine his backyard. They spent a long time near the greenhouse, and I could see them pointing at the ground and taking photographs. Robert was arrested that afternoon. The story that emerged over the following weeks was more horrifying than I could have imagined. Robert Kellerman had been using his greenhouse to hide the bodies of 3 missing persons, 2 women and 1 man who had disappeared over the past 5 years. He'd buried them in an elaborate underground chamber that he'd constructed beneath the greenhouse floor, then used their decomposing remains as fertilizer for his prize-winning garden. The beautiful, perfectly maintained yard that I'd admired so much had been nourished by human remains. The chemical residue I'd found along our fence line wasn't runoff from fertilizers. It was Robert's attempt to kill my garden, so I wouldn't notice the unusual growth patterns in his own yard. Plants grown with human remains as fertilizer apparently grew larger and more vibrant than normal, and he was worried that the contrast between our gardens would draw unwanted attention. During the investigation, police discovered that Robert had been luring victims through online gardening forums, inviting fellow enthusiasts to visit his garden, and then killing them when they arrived. He'd been perfecting his technique for years, using each victim to improve his gardening methods. The most chilling detail was found in the notebook he carried with him every day. It wasn't just gardening notes. It was a detailed record of how different body parts affected plant growth, which organs produced the best fertilizer, and how long various decomposition stages took under different soil conditions. Robert had been treating human beings like gardening experiments. I moved out of the house on Maple Street before the trial began. I couldn't stand looking at that greenhouse, knowing what had been hidden beneath it. But even in my new home, I can't bring myself to start another garden. Every time I see beautiful flowers or perfectly maintained landscaping, I wonder what might be buried underneath, feeding those roots, making those colors so vibrant and unnatural. And I remember Robert's words about plants being predictable, unlike people. He'd found a way to make people predictable too, by turning them into fertilizer for his garden, where he could control exactly how they grew. My name is Thomas, and what I'm about to tell you happened in my apartment building 6 months ago. I've moved twice since then, but I still can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I was living in a converted warehouse in the Arts District downtown, one of those trendy loft buildings with exposed brick and industrial fixtures. My unit was on the 3rd floor, and I'd been there for about a year when Vincent moved into the apartment directly below mine. I first noticed Vincent because of the noise. Not loud music or parties like you'd expect from most tenants in the building, but the constant sound of furniture being moved around. Heavy scraping across the floor, like he was rearranging his entire apartment every few days. It usually happened late at night, sometimes going on until 3 or 4 in the morning. When I finally met Vincent in person, he seemed normal enough. He was probably in his early 40s, average height with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He dressed like a college professor. Sweater vests, khakis, and always carried a worn leather messenger bag. When I introduced myself in the lobby one morning, he was polite but seemed nervous, constantly adjusting his glasses and avoiding eye contact. "I'm Thomas from 3B, I said, extending my hand. "I think you're right below me." "Vincent," he replied, shaking my hand briefly. "Yes, 2B. I hope I haven't been too disruptive with the moving. I'm still getting settled." "No problem at all. Just curious, are you redecorating? I hear furniture moving around pretty regularly." Vincent's expression shifted slightly, and he seemed to choose his words carefully. "I collect antiques. I like to rotate my displays frequently to appreciate different pieces." That explained the constant rearranging, though it seemed like an unusual hobby for someone living in a modern loft apartment. But people had all kinds of interests, and Vincent seemed harmless enough. Over the next few weeks, I started paying more attention to Vincent's routine. He left every morning around 9, always carrying that same messenger bag, and returned in the late afternoon. But he also made frequent trips in and out of the building throughout the day, often carrying large packages, or what looked like furniture wrapped in moving blankets. The building had a freight elevator that opened directly into each unit, which made moving large items easy. I'd often hear the elevator running at odd hours, followed by the familiar sound of heavy objects being dragged across Vincent's floor. What struck me as strange was that Vincent never seemed to get rid of anything. I watched from my window as he brought item after item into the building, but I never saw him taking anything out. His apartment had to be getting incredibly crowded. My curiosity was piqued when I started receiving Vincent's mail by mistake. The postal worker for our building was new, and apparently had trouble with the apartment numbers. Over the course of a month, I received at least a dozen packages addressed to Vincent and 2B. The return addresses were fascinating. Auction houses, estate sale companies, antique dealers from all over the country. Some of the packages were small, but others were large enough to contain furniture or artwork. Each time I brought them down to Vincent, he seemed genuinely grateful, but also anxious to get the packages inside his apartment as quickly as possible. "Thank you so much," he'd say, taking the package from me. "I really need to speak with the postal service about this mix-up." "No worries. What kind of antiques do you collect? The return addresses look like some pretty high-end dealers." Vincent would always give vague answers. "Oh, a little bit of everything. Furniture, decorative items, historical pieces. I have eclectic tastes." He'd close the door before I could ask any follow-up questions, leaving me standing in the hallway, wondering what exactly he was accumulating in the apartment below mine. The situation took a disturbing turn in October when I started noticing a smell coming from Vincent's apartment. It wasn't constant, just occasional whiffs that seemed to seep up through the floorboards into my unit. At first, I thought it might be some kind of wood polish or restoration chemicals that Vincent was using on his antiques, but the smell was wrong for that. It was sweet and cloying, with an underlying mustiness that reminded me of old books or fabric that had been stored in a damp basement for too long. Sometimes there was another note to it, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't quite identify. The smell was strongest in my bedroom, which was directly above what I assumed was Vincent's bedroom. It would come and go unpredictably, sometimes absent for days, then suddenly overwhelming enough to wake me up in the middle of the night. I mentioned it to Vincent when I ran into him in the lobby. "I've been noticing an odd smell that seems to be coming from your apartment," I said, trying to be diplomatic. "Are you using any strong chemicals for restoration work?" Vincent's reaction was immediate and defensive. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't use any chemicals. It's probably nothing serious, just wondering if maybe you had a leak or something. Old buildings can have weird ventilation issues. There's no leak, Vincent said firmly. Maybe the smell is coming from somewhere else. He walked away before I could respond, leaving me more convinced than ever that something unusual was happening in his apartment. A few days later, I was working late in my home office when I heard voices coming from Vincent's apartment. This was unusual because I'd never heard him have visitors before. I couldn't make out specific words, but there were definitely multiple people talking. The conversation went on for about an hour, then I heard the familiar sound of heavy furniture being moved around. But this time, it was different. Instead of the careful, methodical scraping I'd grown accustomed to, it sounded frantic and urgent, like Vincent was trying to rearrange things quickly. Around midnight, I heard the freight elevator running. Through my window, I could see Vincent loading something large and wrapped in blankets into a van parked in the alley behind our building. He made several trips, moving what looked like furniture or large boxes. The next morning, Vincent's routine was completely different. Instead of leaving at his usual 9 o'clock, he was gone before I woke up. When he returned that evening, he was carrying cleaning supplies, industrial-strength disinfectants, air fresheners, and what looked like professional carpet cleaning equipment. The smell from his apartment disappeared entirely after that night. I started keeping a closer eye on Vincent's activities. Something about the midnight furniture moving and the sudden elimination of the mysterious smell felt significant, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what was bothering me. That's when I noticed the pattern in his mail deliveries. Vincent wasn't just receiving packages from antique dealers. He was also getting a lot of mail from estate sale companies, but not the kind of promotional materials you'd expect. These were official-looking documents, legal papers, and what appeared to be inventory lists. One package that was delivered to my apartment by mistake was particularly intriguing. It was from a law firm specializing in estate settlements, and the return address indicated it contained personal effects and documentation. When I brought it down to Vincent, he seemed more agitated than usual. "This is very important," he said, clutching the package tightly. "I can't afford to have these deliveries going to the wrong address." "Maybe you should put a note on your mailbox to make sure the postal worker gets it right," I suggested. "Yes, I'll do that," Vincent said, but he was already closing the door. That night, I heard Vincent on the phone having what sounded like a heated conversation. I couldn't make out most of it, but I caught fragments that made my skin crawl. "The documentation is complete," he was saying. "Everything is properly cataloged. No, there won't be any problems. The previous owner won't be needing them anymore." The way he said "previous owner" sent chills down my spine. Combined with the mysterious packages, the strange smells, and the midnight furniture moving, I was starting to suspect that Vincent's antique collecting might involve more than just buying items from legitimate dealers. I decided to do some research. Using the return addresses from the packages I'd received by mistake, I started looking up the estate sale companies and auction houses that Vincent was dealing with. What I found was disturbing. Several of the companies specialized in estate liquidation services. Basically, they handled the belongings of people who had died with no living relatives to claim their possessions. But some of the addresses led to businesses that didn't seem to exist anymore, or to companies that had been investigated for questionable practices. One auction house in particular caught my attention. According to news articles I found online, they'd been shut down 2 years earlier for selling items that had been reported stolen. The owner had disappeared before charges could be filed. Yet Vincent was still receiving packages from this supposedly defunct business. I started taking photos of the packages that were delivered to my apartment by mistake, documenting the return addresses and postmarks. I also began keeping a log of Vincent's activities. When he left, when he returned, when I heard furniture being moved, when the mysterious smells appeared. A pattern emerged that made my blood run cold. Every few weeks, Vincent would receive a large shipment of packages from estate sale companies. A few days later, the smell would appear in his apartment. Then there would be a night of frantic furniture moving, followed by Vincent loading wrapped items into a van and driving away. After that, the smell would disappear, and the cycle would start over. It was like Vincent was receiving shipments of items, doing something to them that created the terrible smell, then disposing of them in the middle of the night. But what could he be doing to antiques that would create such an awful odor? The answer came to me when I remembered something Vincent had said during one of our early conversations. He'd mentioned that he liked to rotate his displays to appreciate different pieces. At the time, I'd assumed he meant rearranging furniture to showcase different antiques. But what if he meant something else entirely? What if Vincent wasn't collecting antiques at all, but collecting something that came with the antiques? Something that would explain the estate sale connections, the mysterious smells, and the need for midnight disposal runs? I started researching estate sales more carefully, focusing on what happened to personal belongings when someone died alone with no family to claim their possessions. What I learned made me sick. In many cases, estate sale companies would purchase entire households of belongings, including personal items like clothing, photographs, and even more intimate possessions. These items would then be sold in bulk lots to dealers who would sort through them for anything valuable. But what happened to the items that weren't valuable? The personal photographs, the clothing, the intimate belongings of people who had died alone and forgotten. I realized with growing horror that Vincent might be collecting these personal remnants of dead people. The packages from estate sale companies weren't delivering antiques. They were delivering the personal effects of the deceased. The smell wasn't from restoration chemicals. It was from old clothing, personal items, and possibly even more disturbing remnants of people's lives. Vincent wasn't an antique collector. He was collecting pieces of dead people. The thought made me physically ill, but it explained everything. The constant rearranging of his apartment as he created new displays of personal effects. The need to dispose of items periodically when they became too deteriorated or when the smell became overwhelming. The legal documents from estate settlement firms. Vincent was building some kind of shrine or museum dedicated to people who had died alone and been forgotten. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure what. Collecting personal effects of deceased people wasn't necessarily illegal, especially if he was purchasing them legitimately from estate sale companies. But something about the whole situation felt deeply wrong and disturbing. The decision was made for me when I came home from work one evening and found Vincent standing in my apartment. I'd left my door unlocked, something I'd done hundreds of times in what I thought was a secure building. Vincent was standing in my living room, holding one of my personal photographs and examining it closely. "Vincent, what are you doing in my apartment?" He looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. His usual nervous demeanor was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. "I was just admiring your personal effects," he said calmly. "You have some very interesting pieces. This photograph, for instance. It has a lovely patina of age and emotional significance. You need to leave. Now." Vincent set down the photograph, but didn't move toward the door. "You know, Thomas, I've been thinking about our conversations regarding my collecting. I believe you've developed some misconceptions about my hobby. I don't care about your hobby. I want you out of my apartment." "The thing is," Vincent continued as if I hadn't spoken, "my collection is very specific. I don't just collect antiques or personal effects. I collect the essence of people who have been forgotten. People who died alone, with no one to remember them or cherish their belongings." He picked up another photograph from my shelf, this one of my parents. "But lately, I've been thinking about expanding my collection, including people who aren't quite forgotten yet, but who could be. People who live alone, who don't have many close relationships, who might not be missed right away if they disappeared." The implication hit me like a physical blow. Vincent wasn't just collecting the belongings of dead people. He was planning to create new additions to his collection. I backed toward my kitchen, where I kept a set of knives, but Vincent moved to block my path. "The beautiful thing about living in a building like this," he said conversationally, "is that people come and go all the time. Tenants move out suddenly, break leases, disappear without notice. No one thinks twice about it." "People will notice if I disappear," I said, though I wasn't sure that was true. I worked freelance, had few close friends in the city, and my family lived across the country. "Perhaps," Vincent said, "but by the time they do, you'll already be part of my collection. Your personal effects will be properly cataloged and displayed, and your essence will be preserved forever." He reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a small bottle and a cloth. The sweet, chemical smell that emanated from it made me dizzy, just from breathing it. I lunged for the kitchen, but Vincent was faster than he looked. He grabbed my arm and pressed the cloth against my face. The last thing I remember was the overwhelming smell of chemicals, and Vincent's voice saying, "Don't worry, Thomas. You're going to be part of something beautiful." I woke up in a hospital 3 days later. According to the police, my upstairs neighbor had called 911 when she heard what sounded like a struggle in my apartment. When officers arrived, they found me unconscious on my living room floor and Vincent gone. The search of Vincent's apartment revealed the most disturbing crime scene the investigators had ever encountered. The entire space had been converted into a macabre museum of personal effects from dozens of deceased individuals. Clothing, photographs, jewelry, and personal items were arranged in elaborate displays throughout the apartment. But most horrifying were the recent additions to Vincent's collection. Personal belongings from 3 people who had been reported missing over the past year. People who, like me, had lived alone and might not have been missed immediately. Vincent was never found. He disappeared completely, taking his messenger bag and leaving behind only his grotesque collection of human memories. The police believe he's still out there, probably in another city, building a new collection and looking for new people to add to it. People who live alone, who might not be missed right away, who could become part of his twisted preservation of forgotten lives. I've moved twice since then, always to buildings with good security and multiple roommates. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sound of furniture being moved around. And I wonder if Vincent has found me again. And I wonder how many other people out there are living above their own personal collector, never knowing that someone is cataloging their belongings and planning to make them part of a museum dedicated to the forgotten dead. My name is Derek, and I need to tell someone about what happened in my apartment complex last winter. I've been carrying this story for months now, and I can't shake the feeling that what I witnessed was just the beginning of something much worse. I was living in Riverside Towers, a 12-story apartment building on the east side of the city. It wasn't the nicest place, the kind of building where young professionals lived because the rent was cheap and the location was convenient. I'd been there for about 6 months when I started noticing something strange about my neighbor across the hall. His name was Carl Brennan, and he lived in apartment 7F while I was in 7G. Carl appeared to be in his late 30s, with prematurely gray hair, and the pale complexion of someone who didn't spend much time outdoors. He was thin to the point of being gaunt, and he always wore the same type of outfit. Dark jeans and a plain black t-shirt, like he'd bought a dozen identical sets. What made Carl unusual wasn't his appearance, but his schedule. While most of us left for work during normal business hours, Carl's routine was completely backwards. He'd leave his apartment every evening around 11 p.m., carrying a large duffel bag, and wouldn't return until 6 or 7 in the morning. Then he'd sleep all day, with blackout curtains drawn tight across his windows. I work in IT support, so I keep pretty regular hours, but I'm also a bit of an insomniac. I'd often be up late working on freelance projects or just browsing the internet, which is how I became so aware of Carl's nocturnal habits. Night after night, I'd hear his door open and close at exactly 11 p.m., followed by the sound of the elevator taking him down to the lobby. At first, I assumed Carl worked a night shift somewhere. Maybe security, hospital work, or some kind of industrial job. Plenty of people work overnight, and there was nothing inherently suspicious about it. But as weeks passed, I started noticing details that didn't quite fit the normal night shift worker profile. Carl never seemed tired when he returned in the mornings. I'd occasionally see him in the hallway as I was leaving for work, and he always looked alert and energetic, not like someone who just finished a long night of labor. He also never looked dirty or disheveled, which seemed odd for someone doing physical work. More puzzling was the duffel bag he carried every night. It was always the same bag, black canvas with multiple pockets, and it always appeared to be heavy. Carl would struggle slightly with its weight as he walked to the elevator, shifting it from one shoulder to the other. But when he returned in the morning, the bag looked empty, hanging limp at his side. What was Carl taking out of the building every night that he didn't bring back? My curiosity deepened when I started paying attention to the sounds coming from Carl's apartment during the day. Since he supposedly slept while I worked from home, I expected his apartment to be silent. Instead, I heard frequent movement, footsteps, the sound of furniture being moved, and what sounded like power tools being used. The power tool noise was particularly strange. It would happen in short bursts, usually in the early afternoon, and it sounded like a drill or maybe a small saw. Whatever Carl was doing, it required precision work that couldn't be done quietly. I mentioned the noise to building management, not as a complaint, but just to ask if Carl had gotten permission for renovation work. The property manager, Mrs. Chen, looked confused. Renovation work? Mr. Brennan hasn't submitted any requests for modifications to his unit. Are you sure the noise is coming from his apartment? Pretty sure. It's right across the hall from me. And it happens almost every day, around the same time. Mrs. Chen made a note to follow up, but I never heard anything more about it. The power tool sounds continued, always during the day when Carl was supposed to be sleeping. In December, I started noticing a smell coming from Carl's apartment. It wasn't constant, but every few days there would be a chemical odor that seeped into the hallway. It reminded me of cleaning supplies, but stronger and more acrid, like industrial solvents or paint thinner. The smell was always strongest in the evening, right around the time Carl would leave for his mysterious night job. I'd step into the hallway and be hit with this overwhelming chemical scent that made my eyes water. But by morning, when Carl returned, the smell would be completely gone. I started keeping a mental log of Carl's activities, trying to piece together what he might be doing. The pattern was always the same. Daytime power tool work, evening chemical smells, then Carl leaving with his heavy duffel bag and returning with it empty. It was like he was creating something during the day, treating it with chemicals in the evening, then taking it somewhere at night. But what could he be making that required such secrecy? The answer started to become clear when I noticed that Carl's apartment had been receiving an unusual number of deliveries. I work from home most days, so I'm around when packages arrive, and I'd started paying attention to what was being delivered to 7F. Most of the packages were from medical supply companies, not the kind of supplies you'd expect for someone with a chronic illness, but professional-grade equipment. I caught glimpses of labels mentioning things like surgical instruments, preservation solutions, and specimen containers. Carl also received regular deliveries of what appeared to be art supplies, canvases, paints, brushes, and other materials. But these weren't coming from typical art stores. The return addresses were from scientific supply companies and medical equipment dealers. The combination of medical supplies and art materials, along with the power tools and chemical smells, was starting to paint a disturbing picture in my mind. My suspicions crystallized one night in January when I couldn't sleep, and decided to see exactly where Carl went during his nightly excursions. I waited until I heard his door close at 11 p.m., then quickly grabbed my coat and followed him down to the lobby. Carl walked out of the building and got into a white van parked on the street. I watched from the lobby window as he drove away, noting the license plate number. Then I went back upstairs and spent the rest of the night researching what I could find about Carl Brennan. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Carl had a criminal record. Nothing recent, but about 8 years earlier, he'd been arrested for breaking into a funeral home. The charges had been dropped due to lack of evidence, but the police report mentioned that Carl had been found in the embalming room with what appeared to be art supplies. The report suggested that Carl had been attempting to create some kind of artwork using the bodies in the funeral home, though the exact nature of his activities was never determined. He'd claimed he was an artist working on a project about death and preservation, but the funeral home director said nothing had been disturbed. I also found references to Carl in several online forums dedicated to what they called death art, a disturbing subculture of people who created artwork using human remains, or who were obsessed with preserving and displaying dead bodies. Carl's username appeared in discussions about preservation techniques, artistic uses for human tissue, and methods for acquiring materials for such projects. The more I read, the more convinced I became that Carl was using his apartment as some kind of workshop for creating illegal artwork using human remains. The medical supplies would be for preservation, the art materials for decoration or display, and the power tools for... I didn't want to think about what the power tools might be for. But where was he getting the bodies? The answer came to me when I remembered Carl's nightly schedule. He left every night at 11 p.m. and returned at dawn, always with an empty duffel bag. Those were exactly the hours when most funeral homes, morgues, and hospitals would have minimal staff on duty. Carl wasn't working a night shift. He was stealing bodies. I knew I had to contact the police, but I also knew that my suspicions alone wouldn't be enough for them to get a search warrant. I needed more concrete evidence of what Carl was doing in his apartment. That evidence came sooner than I expected. 2 nights later, I was woken up around 3 a.m. by the sound of Carl returning to the building. This was unusual. He normally didn't come back until dawn. I heard him struggling with something heavy in the hallway, cursing under his breath as he tried to get his door open. Curiosity got the better of me. I crept to my door and looked through the peephole. Carl was dragging what looked like a large canvas bag into his apartment. The bag was roughly the size and shape of a human body, and it was clearly heavy enough to require significant effort to move. But what made my stomach turn was the smell. Even through my closed door, I could detect the unmistakable odor of decomposition, mixed with the chemical preservatives I'd been smelling for weeks. Carl had brought a body back to his apartment. I called the police immediately. I told them everything: Carl's strange schedule, the medical supply deliveries, his criminal history, and what I just witnessed. The officer who took my call seemed skeptical at first, but when I mentioned the smell of decomposition, his tone became more serious. "We'll send someone out to investigate," he said. "In the meantime, stay in your apartment and don't confront your neighbor." The police arrived about an hour later. I watched through my peephole as they knocked on Carl's door, then used a master key from building management to enter when he didn't respond. What they found inside apartment 7F made headlines in the local news for weeks. Carl had converted his entire apartment into what investigators described as a macabre art studio. The living room had been set up as a workshop, with medical equipment for preserving human tissue and power tools for cutting and shaping bone. The bedroom had been turned into a gallery space, displaying what Carl apparently considered his artistic creations. The police found the remains of 7 different people in various stages of Carl's artistic process. Some had been preserved and posed in elaborate tableaux. Others had been partially dismantled and incorporated into sculptures or paintings. The level of detail and craftsmanship was reportedly both impressive and deeply disturbing. Carl himself was found in the bathroom, dead from an apparent suicide. He'd left behind detailed journals documenting his activities, including how he'd been stealing bodies from funeral homes, morgues, and even hospital storage areas across the city. His entries described his work as preserving the beauty of death and creating eternal art from temporary flesh. The investigation revealed that Carl had been operating for at least 2 years, possibly longer. He'd developed an elaborate system for identifying vulnerable targets. Bodies that were unlikely to be missed immediately, people who died alone with no family to claim them, or remains that were being stored temporarily before burial or cremation. What haunted me most was reading in the police reports that Carl had been planning to expand his operation. His journals mentioned his interest in live subjects, and his belief that his art would be even more powerful if he could control the entire process from death to preservation. The police found evidence that Carl had been watching several residents of our building, taking notes on our schedules and habits. My name was in his journal, along with detailed observations about my routine and lifestyle. He'd been planning to make me part of his collection. I moved out of Riverside Towers the day after Carl's body was discovered. I couldn't stand the thought of living across the hall from that apartment, knowing what had been happening just a few feet away from where I slept every night. But what really keeps me awake now is the knowledge that Carl wasn't unique. The online forums I'd found were full of people with similar interests, and the police investigation revealed that Carl had been in contact with others who shared his obsession with death art. Somewhere out there, in apartment buildings and houses across the country, there are other people like Carl, people who work night shifts that aren't really jobs, who receive mysterious deliveries and create strange smells, who disappear in the middle of the night with heavy bags and return with them empty. And they're all looking for their next piece of art. I've learned to pay attention to my neighbors in ways I never did before. I notice unusual schedules, strange deliveries, and chemical smells. Because I know now that the person living next door might not be who they appear to be. They might be an artist working with materials that no one should ever use, creating beauty from horror in the darkness of the night shift. My name is Sarah, and I need to tell someone about what I discovered about my neighbor last fall. Even now, months later, I can't drive past a playground without feeling sick to my stomach. I moved into the duplex on Elm Street in September, right after starting my new job as a kindergarten teacher. It was perfect for my budget. A small 2-bedroom unit that shared a wall with an identical apartment next door. The neighborhood was quiet and family-friendly. Exactly what I wanted as a single woman living alone for the first time. My neighbor in the other half of the duplex was a woman named Linda Morrison. She appeared to be in her 50s, with short gray hair and a soft, grandmotherly appearance. When I introduced myself the day I moved in, she was incredibly welcoming, bringing over homemade cookies and offering to help with anything I needed. "It's so nice to have a young teacher living next door," Linda said, settling into my kitchen with a cup of coffee. "I just love children. I used to be a babysitter myself, back when my own kids were young." "Do your children live nearby?" I asked. Linda's expression grew sad. "Oh no. They're all grown up and moved away. I hardly see them anymore, but I keep myself busy with other children in the neighborhood." I learned that Linda ran an informal babysitting service from her home. Throughout the week, I'd see parents dropping off children of various ages. Toddlers, elementary school kids, even some teenagers. Linda's house always seemed to be full of young voices and laughter. As a teacher, I appreciated having a neighbor who was good with children. It made me feel safer in the neighborhood, knowing there was someone nearby who understood kids and could help in an emergency. But as the weeks passed, I started noticing things about Linda's babysitting operation that seemed unusual. The first thing that struck me was the hours. Parents would drop children off at Linda's house at all times of day and night, early morning, late evening, even on weekends. Some kids seemed to stay for days at a time. I'd see the same children playing in Linda's backyard for several consecutive days, wearing the same clothes. I also noticed that Linda never seemed to take the children anywhere. Most babysitters I knew would take kids to parks, libraries, or other activities, but Linda's charges never left her property. They played in her fenced backyard or stayed inside the house. Even on beautiful sunny days, the children remained confined to Linda's yard. The backyard itself was strange. Linda had installed an unusually high privacy fence, at least 8 feet tall, that completely blocked the view from the street. She'd also put up what looked like soundproofing material along the inside of the fence, claiming it was to reduce noise for the neighbors. But the most disturbing thing was how the children behaved around Linda. I could see into Linda's backyard from my upstairs bedroom window, and I'd often watch the kids playing while I graded papers or prepared lessons. What I observed didn't look like normal play. The children seemed subdued, almost mechanical in their movements. They'd sit quietly in small groups, rarely running around or making the kind of noise you'd expect from kids. When Linda appeared in the yard, the children's behavior would change immediately. They'd all stop what they were doing and look at her with what appeared to be fear. If she called one of them over, they'd approach slowly, reluctantly, like they were being summoned for punishment. I started paying closer attention to the parents who dropped off children at Linda's house. Many of them looked stressed, desperate even. They'd have hurried conversations with Linda at the front door, often handing over not just their children, but also bags of clothes and supplies, as if the kids were staying for extended periods. Some of the parents looked like they were struggling financially. Worn clothing, older cars, the general appearance of people dealing with economic hardship. Others seemed to be dealing with personal crises. I'd see women with bruises or black eyes, men who looked like they hadn't slept in days. Linda appeared to be targeting families in crisis, offering her babysitting services to people who were desperate for help with their children. But what kind of help was she really providing? My concerns deepened when I started hearing sounds from Linda's house at night. Not the normal sounds of children sleeping, but crying. Quiet, muffled sobbing that would go on for hours. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like multiple children crying at once, a chorus of misery that made my heart ache. I also heard Linda's voice during these nighttime episodes, but not the gentle, grandmotherly tone she used during the day. At night, her voice was sharp and commanding, issuing what sounded like threats or punishments. "Stop that crying right now," I'd hear her say through the thin walls. "You know what happens to children who don't behave." The crying would stop immediately, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow even more disturbing. As a teacher, I was trained to recognize signs of child abuse, and everything I was observing about Linda's operation was raising red flags. But I also knew that making accusations without solid evidence could be dangerous, especially if I was wrong. I decided to do some research on Linda Morrison. What I found was deeply troubling. Linda had been investigated by Child Protective Services multiple times over the past decade, always for allegations related to her babysitting business. The investigations had never resulted in charges, but the pattern was concerning. Reports of children being kept for longer than agreed upon, parents having difficulty getting their children back, and allegations of inappropriate discipline. I also found court records showing that Linda had lost custody of her own children 20 years earlier due to neglect and abuse. Her parental rights had been terminated, and she'd been prohibited from having unsupervised contact with minors for several years. But those restrictions had apparently expired, and Linda had found a way to surround herself with children again through her babysitting service. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that Linda was using her business to exploit vulnerable families and potentially abuse their children. But I still needed concrete evidence before I could contact authorities. That evidence came in November when I witnessed something that made me physically sick. I was working late one evening, grading papers at my kitchen table, when I heard a car pull up outside. Through my window, I saw a woman I didn't recognize getting out of a beat-up sedan. She looked young, maybe early 20s, and she was clearly distressed, crying and shaking as she walked to Linda's front door. The woman was carrying a small child, probably around 2 years old, who was also crying. The conversation at Linda's door was brief but intense. I could see the young woman gesturing frantically, and Linda nodding and taking the child from her arms. The woman got back in her car and drove away, leaving the toddler with Linda. But what I witnessed next made my blood run cold. As soon as the car was out of sight, Linda's demeanor changed completely. The gentle, caring expression she'd worn while talking to the mother disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. She looked down at the crying child in her arms with what could only be described as disgust. Then Linda carried the child into her backyard, where I could see her through my bedroom window. She set the toddler down in what looked like a small cage or pen, a wooden structure I'd never noticed before, partially hidden behind some bushes. The child immediately started crying louder, reaching through the bars toward Linda. But instead of comforting the toddler, Linda walked away, leaving the child alone in the cage. I watched in horror as the toddler cried for what felt like hours, calling for his mother while Linda ignored him completely. Other children in the yard seemed to know better than to approach the cage or try to help. I couldn't stand it anymore. I called the police. "I need to report suspected child abuse," I told the dispatcher. "My neighbor is running an illegal babysitting operation, and I just watched her put a toddler in a cage." The police arrived within 20 minutes. I watched from my window as officers knocked on Linda's door, then walked around to examine her backyard. What they found there led to Linda's immediate arrest and the removal of 7 children who had been staying at her house. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Linda's operation. She had been targeting families in crisis, single mothers, parents dealing with addiction, families facing eviction or other emergencies, and offering to care for their children during difficult times. But instead of providing legitimate childcare, Linda had been essentially holding the children captive. Parents who tried to retrieve their children were told they owed money for extended care, or that their children were better off staying with Linda. Some parents were threatened with reports to Child Protective Services if they tried to take their children back. The children themselves were subjected to psychological abuse, designed to make them compliant and afraid. Linda used isolation, food deprivation, and emotional manipulation to control them. The cage I'd seen was just one of several punishment devices found in her house. Most disturbing was the discovery that Linda had been documenting her activities. Police found hundreds of photographs and videos of the children in various states of distress, which Linda had been selling to people with sick interests in child suffering. Linda Morrison was sentenced to 25 years in prison for child abuse, kidnapping, and distribution of child exploitation material. The 7 children found in her house were returned to their families or placed in protective custody. But the case haunted me long after Linda was convicted. During the trial, I learned that several of the parents had been desperate enough to leave their children with Linda because they had no other options. They were facing homelessness, domestic violence, or other crises that made them vulnerable to someone like Linda. The system had failed these families, leaving them with no choice but to trust their children to a predator who exploited their desperation. I still live in the duplex on Elm Street, but Linda's half remains empty. Sometimes I look out my bedroom window at her backyard, now overgrown and abandoned, and I think about all the children who suffered there while I was just a few feet away, unaware of what was happening. I've become much more vigilant about the children in my neighborhood and my classroom. I watch for signs of abuse, listen for unusual situations, and I never hesitate to report my concerns to authorities, because I learned that predators like Linda Morrison don't look like monsters. They look like friendly grandmothers who bake cookies and offer to help with your children. They target the most vulnerable families, the ones who are too desperate or too scared to ask questions. And they're living right next door, hiding their crimes behind privacy fences and soundproofing, while the rest of us go about our daily lives, never suspecting that children are suffering just a few feet away. The scariest part is knowing that Linda wasn't unique. There are others out there, running similar operations, exploiting desperate families, and abusing vulnerable children. They're in every community, hiding behind legitimate seeming businesses and friendly facades. And they're always looking for their next victims. Families in crisis who need help with their children and don't have anywhere else to turn. My name is Alex, and what I'm about to tell you happened in my apartment building 8 months ago. I've moved since then, but I still check my locks 3 times every night, and I can't listen to music without remembering what I heard coming through those walls. I was living in Westfield Commons, a mid-rise apartment complex that catered mostly to young professionals. My unit was on the 5th floor, 5C, and I'd been there for about a year when someone new moved into 5D, the apartment next to mine. His name was Martin Reeves, and he seemed like the kind of neighbor you'd barely notice. He was probably in his early 40s, average height with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He dressed conservatively, button-down shirts and slacks, and carried himself like an accountant or office manager. When I introduced myself in the hallway, he was polite but reserved, offering a brief handshake and a quiet "nice to meet you" before disappearing into his apartment. What made Martin unusual wasn't his appearance or personality, but the sounds that came from his apartment. Not loud music or television like you'd expect from most neighbors, but something much stranger. The constant sound of voices talking. At first, I assumed Martin was just someone who kept the TV or radio on for background noise. Plenty of people do that, especially those who live alone. But as days passed, I started paying closer attention to what I was hearing through our shared wall. The voices were always different. Sometimes it sounded like a man and woman having a conversation, other times like multiple people talking at once. The conversations would go on for hours, starting early in the morning and continuing late into the night. But what struck me as odd was that I never heard Martin's voice among them. I work as a software developer, mostly from home, so I was around the apartment during the day when most people would be at work. Yet the voices from Martin's apartment continued regardless of the time. It was like he had a constant stream of visitors, which seemed unlikely for someone as reserved as he appeared to be. The conversations themselves were strange too. When I listened carefully, they didn't sound like normal social interactions. The voices would repeat the same phrases over and over, or have exchanges that didn't quite make sense, contextually. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like the same conversation, happening multiple times throughout the day. After about 2 weeks of this, I started to suspect that Martin wasn't having live conversations at all, but was playing recordings of some kind. But why would someone play recorded conversations all day and night? My curiosity deepened when I realized that I never saw Martin having actual visitors. I kept fairly irregular hours due to my work schedule, and I was often coming and going at different times of day. But I never once saw anyone entering or leaving Martin's apartment, except Martin himself. Yet the voices continued constantly. I also noticed that Martin's routine was extremely rigid. He left his apartment every morning at exactly 8:15 a.m., carrying a black briefcase and wearing the same style of conservative clothing. He'd return at exactly 6:30 p.m., again carrying the briefcase. His schedule never varied, not even on weekends, but the voices in his apartment continued even when he was gone. This meant that Martin was definitely playing recordings, not having live conversations, but the recordings ran continuously, even when he wasn't home to listen to them. It was like he was creating the illusion of constant human presence in his apartment, even when he was alone. The situation became more disturbing when I started recognizing some of the voices. One afternoon, while working at my kitchen table, I heard a conversation coming from Martin's apartment that made me stop typing and listen carefully. One of the voices sounded familiar, not like someone I knew personally, but like someone I'd heard before. It took me a few minutes to place it, but then I realized where I'd heard that voice. It was my downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Patterson from 4C. She had a distinctive accent and speaking pattern that was unmistakable. But Mrs. Patterson was an elderly woman who rarely left her apartment, and certainly wasn't the type to be socializing with Martin. How could her voice be part of his recordings? Over the next few days, I paid closer attention to the voices coming from Martin's apartment. To my growing alarm, I started recognizing more of them. There was Mr. Kim from 3B, who I'd spoken with several times in the elevator. There was Jennifer from 5A, who I'd had coffee with a few weeks earlier. There was even what sounded like my own voice, though I couldn't remember ever having a conversation with Martin. Martin was somehow recording the voices of people in our building and playing them back in his apartment. But how was he getting these recordings? And why? The answer to the first question became clear when I started paying attention to Martin's briefcase. Every morning he'd leave with it looking normal, flat and professional. But when he returned in the evening, The briefcase appeared slightly bulkier, like it contained more than just papers. I also noticed that Martin would sometimes make additional trips in and out of the building during the day, always carrying the briefcase. These trips were brief, usually less than an hour, and they seemed to correspond with times when other residents would typically be home. I began to suspect that Martin was using some kind of recording equipment to capture conversations throughout the building, then bringing the recordings back to his apartment to play them. But the why remained a mystery until I witnessed something that made my blood run cold. One evening, I was coming home from dinner with friends when I saw Martin in the hallway outside my apartment. He was crouched down next to my door, holding what looked like a small electronic device against the wall. When he heard the elevator opening, he quickly stood up and pretended to be unlocking his own door. "Evening, Alex," he said casually, as if nothing had happened. "Hi, Martin," I replied, but I was watching him carefully. The device he'd been holding was nowhere to be seen. He must have slipped it into his pocket. That night I couldn't sleep. The thought that Martin had been recording my conversations, possibly for weeks or months, made me feel violated and paranoid. But it also raised a more disturbing question. What was he doing with all these recordings? I decided to do some investigating of my own. The next morning after Martin left for work, I examined the hallway outside my apartment carefully. I didn't find any obvious recording devices, but I did notice something strange. There were small holes in the wall near my door, tiny punctures that looked like they'd been made recently. I found similar holes near other apartment doors throughout the building. Someone had been drilling small holes in the walls, probably to insert listening devices. That evening, I called the building management to report my suspicions. The property manager, Mr. Rodriguez, seemed skeptical at first. "You're saying your neighbor is recording other tenants' conversations?" he asked. "I think so. I've been hearing voices from his apartment that I recognize as other residents, and I found evidence of holes being drilled near apartment doors." Mr. Rodriguez agreed to investigate. The next day, he and a maintenance worker examined the hallway walls and confirmed that someone had indeed been drilling holes and inserting what appeared to be small microphones. But when they confronted Martin about it, he denied everything. He claimed he had no knowledge of any recording devices and suggested that perhaps someone else in the building was responsible. Without concrete evidence linking Martin to the devices, there wasn't much the building management could do except remove the microphones and warn residents to be vigilant. But I knew Martin was responsible, and I was determined to prove it. That weekend, I decided to follow Martin during one of his mysterious daytime trips. I waited in the lobby until I saw him leave with his briefcase, then followed him at a distance. Martin didn't leave the building. Instead, he went down to the basement level, where the storage units and utility rooms were located. I watched from the stairwell as he used a key to enter what appeared to be a maintenance room. I waited for about 20 minutes, then saw Martin emerge from the room. His briefcase now looked bulkier, and he was carrying what appeared to be a small bag of equipment. After Martin returned to his apartment, I went down to the basement to investigate. The maintenance room he'd entered was supposed to be locked and accessible only to building staff, but the door was slightly ajar. Inside, I found something that made my stomach turn. The room had been converted into a sophisticated surveillance center. The walls were lined with recording equipment, monitors, and what looked like a central processing unit for audio feeds. There were dozens of small speakers, each labeled with an apartment number. Martin had tapped into the building's entire communication system. He wasn't just recording conversations from individual apartments. He was monitoring every phone call, every conversation, every sound made by every resident in the building. But the most disturbing discovery was a wall covered with detailed profiles of building residents. Each profile included photographs, personal information, daily schedules, and transcripts of recorded conversations. Martin had been studying all of us, learning our habits, our relationships, our secrets. My own profile was particularly extensive. Martin had recorded dozens of my phone calls, conversations with friends, even private moments when I thought I was alone. He'd documented my work schedule, my dating life, my family relationships, everything. But what chilled me most was a section in each profile, labeled vulnerabilities. Martin had been analyzing the recordings to identify each resident's weaknesses, fears, and potential pressure points. Under my name, he'd written, lives alone, works from home, limited local social connections, potential for isolation and manipulation, responds to authority figures, fears confrontation. I realized that Martin wasn't just recording us for voyeuristic purposes. He was studying us, learning how to manipulate and control us. I took photos of everything in the room with my phone, then got out of there as quickly as possible. Back in my apartment, I called the police immediately. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Martin's operation. He had been running an elaborate surveillance and manipulation scheme, not just in our building, but in several others across the city. Martin worked for a data collection company that specialized in gathering personal information for marketing purposes. But he'd been using his position to conduct illegal surveillance operations, recording private conversations and selling the information to various clients. The recordings weren't just being used for marketing. Police found evidence that Martin had been blackmailing residents based on information gathered from their private conversations. He'd also been selling personal data to identity thieves and other criminals. Most disturbing was the discovery that Martin had been planning to escalate his activities. His notes indicated that he was preparing to move beyond passive surveillance to active manipulation, using the information he'd gathered to coerce residents into specific behaviors or relationships. Martin Reeves was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including illegal surveillance, blackmail, and identity theft. The investigation revealed that he'd been operating similar schemes in at least 6 other apartment buildings over the past 3 years. But the damage was already done. Every resident in our building had to deal with the knowledge that our most private moments had been recorded and analyzed by a stranger. Some people moved out immediately, unable to feel safe in their own homes. I stayed for a few more months, but I never felt comfortable there again. Every conversation, every phone call, every moment of privacy felt tainted by the knowledge of what Martin had done. The worst part was learning how much he'd known about all of us. During the trial, some of the recorded conversations were played as evidence. Hearing my own voice, discussing personal matters, knowing that Martin had been listening and taking notes, made me feel sick. I moved to a different city shortly after Martin was convicted. But the experience changed how I think about privacy and security. I'm constantly aware now of who might be listening, who might be watching, who might be gathering information about my life. Because I learned that predators like Martin don't break into your home or attack you on the street. They listen through your walls, record your conversations, and study your vulnerabilities until they know you better than you know yourself. And they use that knowledge to control you in ways you never see coming. The scariest part is knowing that Martin's operation was sophisticated, but not unique. There are others out there using technology to invade our privacy and gather information about our lives. They're in apartment buildings, office complexes, and neighborhoods everywhere. They're listening to everything we say, learning everything about us, and waiting for the right moment to use that information against us. And we never know they're there until it's too late.